Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte tells Barack Obama to go to hell and appears to favor China over the US. And a Hong Kong pro-democracy activist is detained in Thailand. Is the US losing traditional allies in Asia to Beijing? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has been actively courting China despite a long-running and bitter dispute over competing claims in the South China Sea. And he's responded to Western criticism of his war on drugs with incendiary comments. Barack Obama, a prominent target.
Instead of helping us, ang unang tumira itong State Department. So, you can go to hell. Mr. Obama, you can go to hell.
Thailand on Wednesday briefly detained and then deported a Hong Kong student activist who helped to organise pro-democracy protests. 19-year-old Joshua Wong had been invited to speak at Thai universities but was put on a plane back to Hong Kong. China's backed Thailand's military rulers. And since the coup, Bangkok and Beijing have stepped up military and economic ties. Washington has expressed concerns about a nation that it regards as its oldest ally in the region. But US influence remains deep-rooted in most of East Asia. Washington hasn't scaled back military or aid programs for the Philippines, and the two sides have a mutual defense treaty dating back to 1951. With Thailand, the US suspended arms sales after the military coup, but it resumed joint military exercises earlier this year. Communist Vietnam, which once went to war with the US, is now seeking closer ties with Washington as it tries to navigate territorial disputes with Beijing. And China's slowing economy is concerning smaller Asian nations for whom exports to China are crucial. Well, tough talk aside, to what extent can Asian nations realistically step out of America's influence and embrace China? Let's bring in our guests for today's programs. From Manila, we're joined by Chito Santoromana, President of the Philippines Association for Chinese Studies. He's been nominated to become the next ambassador to China, although he's not yet been confirmed, so speaks on Inside Story today as a private citizen. From Singapore, we're joined by Graham Ong Webb, a research fellow at the Institute of Defence and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And from Beijing, Victor Gao, director of the China National Association of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Chito Santoromana, if we start with you first, what are we to make of President Duterte's comments? Is the Philippines president pivoting away from the US towards China? Is there a strategic shift going on in Manila?
Well, in the sense, that is what's happening. But put it in a historical context. The Philippines has historically had this treaty alliance with the US, and particularly in the past couple of years, it has been a policy of tight alliance, tight alignment with the US. What's happening right now is that there is a change in threat perception, and so the Philippines is moving away from the US towards what it calls an independent foreign policy. But it does not mean that the Philippines will therefore swing and align with China. I think what's happening is basically a reconfiguration of Philippine foreign policy such that the Philippines is trying to put into practice what experts and analysts usually call as a hedging strategy. In other words, maintain the friendship and historic alliance with the US, but not to be overly dependent on it, while opening and while improving friendly relations with China, because for the past several years, the relations have actually been frozen, have gone into a deep freeze. So it's really, the pendulum is swinging away from the US, but I think it's not yet in the middle. It's just some degrees off the US.
Graham Ong Webb, is the US's role as the dominant power in the region drawing to a close? Are nations in the East Asia region perhaps right to be considering their options right now?
I think it's still early days to be sure. We are clearly, the winds are changing. and we are witnessing the beginning of a shift, perhaps part of a longer shift that will unfold over the next half decade. But I wouldn't really bet on the outcome just yet. Clearly, countries in the region, Singapore in particular, are put in a position where they seem to be coerced or obliged to choose and take a side. But Singapore, for one, is still hedging. The hedging strategy still has some residual utility for Singapore's foreign policy. But I think you know, the pressure is building up to start looking at options and not just remaining neutral or sitting on the fence.
Victor Gao in Beijing, what do you make of all of this? What are China's ambitions in the region concerning its neighbours? Is it actively looking to usurp the US as the dominant power, or is it just happy to accept that by the very nature of things, that's what's going to happen? It'll sit back and wait.
It is expected that the new president of the Philippines, Mr. Duterte, will visit Beijing very soon, before the end of October. And I think the Chinese government and the Chinese people are enthusiastically welcoming his important state visit to China. And the visit is long overdue. As the other panelist in Manila mentioned, China-Filipino relations went into a deep freeze. It is time for the deep freeze to end and for the Chinese people and the Filipino people to restore their traditional friendship with each other, which lasted for many, many centuries. Now, I would say from the Chinese perspective, all the ASEAN members, they do not need to pick and choose between China and the United States. The vast Pacific and the vast South China Sea are big enough to accommodate all these important interests. I think from the Filipinos' perspective, they need to realize that their national interests need to be defended, and no one in the world should use the Philippines as an instrument of its own foreign policy against an important neighboring country, which is China. And I think President Duterte has demonstrated enough vision and courage and wisdom in realizing that if the Philippines were to be used as an instrument by the United States in US's rivalry with China, then the Philippines actually is going to suffer. And there is no fundamental difference of opinion between China and the Philippines, that these two countries cannot talk with each other in peace and diplomacy. There is the territorial dispute between China and the Philippines, but the best way to resolve these disputes is to do the negotiation and diplomacy, rather than raising the tension in this part of the world as if war or confrontation are the only option forward. With other ASEAN members, including Singapore, for example, China wants to be friends with all of these ASEAN countries. ASEAN is an important concept as far as China is concerned, and China does not want to do anything wrong to damage China's relations and friendship with ASEAN countries. But China will not support ASEAN to be an enemy of China or to be a strong ally of the United States against the national interests of China. So I would say from the ASEAN perspective, they also need to look at the consequences of whether they are picking and choosing between China and the United States. Hopefully, they will be neutral in the rivalry between China and the United States today, as well as in the years to come.
You make some interesting points that I want to put to both Graham and Chito. Let's start with Mr. Santo Romano then in Manila. What did you make of that? That it's in the Philippines' national interest to embrace relations, a renewed relationship with Beijing?
Well, I think there's a realization now that from the Philippine perspective, we should maintain our traditional and historic friendship with the U.S. It's been our traditional ally, but we cannot be overly dependent on the U.S. We have to, that's why they're talking of an independent foreign policy. And when we try to improve relations with China, we want it to be, we don't expect our differences to disappear overnight. But what we expect is that on the one hand, we can talk about our differences and try to resolve them peacefully. On the other hand, that there are areas, non-contentious areas, where we could have areas of cooperation. And this, I think, can be promoted rather quickly as the coming visit of President Duterte to China will demonstrate. So the point, the Philippines is basically trying to find itself in a position where it can be friends with both powers, with the US and with China. Of course, for a long time, we've had a tight alignment with the US to such an extent that our friendship with China was affected. Now, of course, we have some frictions with the US because of the public criticism of the US of the domestic priority project of President Duterte. So that is why you get all this noise. But if you look behind it, the strategic logic in terms of pursuing Philippine national interests is to hedge, to develop friendship with China as well as to maintain friendship with the US.
All right.
And to be friends with all the major powers in the region.
Graham Ong-Webb, is it possible to be friends with both China and the US? How do the region's nations work constructively with a more powerful, a more assertive, a more confident China without compromising or surrendering their national interests?
Well, I think it is possible. I agree with Victor that this region is big enough for everyone to accommodate each other's interests and to build partnerships and to be friends with each other. I truly believe that. But I think a moment of adjustment is unfolding right now, where we need to move away from the extremities, this black and white issue, this zero-sum game. I think there is room for both the US and China to play their respective roles and to apply the comparative advantages in the region to lift the region up. But I think we need to frame those conversations properly and to have this ongoing two-way street in understanding each other's standpoints. I think that's not really happening right now. Case in point with Singapore. Singapore is caught up in a current spat of sorts with China over Singapore's supposed filing of or raising of the South China Sea issue at the Non-Aligned Movement Summit that occurred recently in Venezuela. That's just a case of a lot of misunderstanding and parties may perhaps talking over each other and past each other. We need to align those conversations, and I think I'm still hopeful and optimistic that we can achieve those conversations. We haven't exhausted those channels yet, and I think we should pursue them.
Graham, is the US security umbrella in Asia still credible? How do countries, for instance, like Japan, view the future with China rising?
Well, it's quite a complicated story from my analysis. I mean, when we're talking about US security guarantees in the region, we're not just talking about the South China Sea issue or the East China Sea issue. We're also talking about the ongoing challenges that the region is facing with North Korea and the North Korean security risk that's being posed, not just in Northeast Asia, but across the region. I think everyone's sort of trying to figure out the extent to which the US can make good of those guarantees, especially at a time when the United States itself is caught up in a particular phase of its political cycle, where we are looking at a new administration that's going to come to the fore by the beginning of next year, and whether that administration is going to carry on with those initiatives that have been put in place since 2012, in particular the pivot towards Asia, and whether that pivot is going to have any meaningful salience towards Asia Pacific security.
I want to talk about the pivot in a few moments, but you talk about the disputes in the South China Sea. Both you and Victor Gao have raised it. The US, of course, has been very concerned about what it calls China's aggression in the South China Sea. 6 Asian nations have overlapping claims to the area, but China wants most of it, and it's been deploying ships and military vessels to the waters over the past year. The South China Sea sits on vast oil and gas fields and vital fishing routes. Around $5 trillion worth of sea trade passes through it every year. Victor Gao, does China perceive weakness in the US at the moment? It's been unable to dissuade China from its island building program in the South China Sea. TPP, that's another issue we have yet to talk about, appears to be going nowhere fast. The US appears disinterested in helping any nation to enforce the Hague verdicts that China has no valid claim over the disputed territory in the South China Sea. And of course, President Obama has had very little success in bringing any halt to North Korea's nuclear ambitions. I mean, has President Obama's pivot to Asia policy failed, and is China taking advantage of that?
First of all, please allow me to emphasize that as the largest trading nation in the world, and as the largest manufacturing country in the world, and as the largest economy by purchasing power parity as the benchmark, China cares about safety and security in the South China Sea for the maritime shipping as well as aviation as much as any other country in the world. If there is any disruption of security in maritime security or aviation security, China will suffer most. So this is the common sense that we need to bring to any discussion. And if anyone in the world can cite any single example of disruption of maritime security in the South China Sea, name it. And we can address the fundamental issues behind it. No one can cite any concrete example. Therefore, I think this freedom of navigation as used by the United States is completely a fallacy designed to raise alarm in this part of the world and to sow discord between China and many other countries in this part of the world. I think countries in this part of the world, including the Philippines and Singapore, should have enough wisdom and enough common sense to realize the true game plan behind the U.S. allegation of so-called concern about the freedom of navigation. As far as the U.S. pivot to Asia is concerned, if the U.S. pivot to Asia is designed for peace and stability and mutual trade and commerce, for example, we will open our arms and welcome the U.S. pivot. But if the U.S. pivot is designed to derail China's peaceful rise, to send more military presence to Asia, to militarize the Asian-Pacific region, then China will be firmly standing up and oppose the so-called pivot to Asia. If the United States wants to raise tension by bringing other countries onto its bandwagon to fight against China, then China will commit itself to stand firm on matters of principle against whatever belligerent stance of the United States. That's why we need to see through whatever allegations coming out of Washington and see the real game plan that the United States is deploying in this part of the world.
Chita Santoromano, what do you make of that? Victor Gao talking there of the US's true game plan. He paints China's ambitions in a very benign way. What about China's true game plan? Can the Philippines, do you think, rely on the US to back it militarily, for instance, over the dispute in the South China Sea? Or does it not matter anymore?
Well, from the point of view, from the Philippine perspective, I think the big picture is really there is a strategic rivalry, a strategic competition between the rising power that is China and the dominant power, but also declining power that is the US. And what we're seeing, there are elements of cooperation to be sure, but the elements of competition are also intensifying. And the concrete manifestation is really in the South China Sea. Here, I think, we're seeing the clash of strategic interests between the two powers. China would like to extend its influence there, and the US would like to maintain its influence. For the Philippines, though, we do not wish to be caught in the crossfire. And I think this is the basis, the strategic logic between, that you try to be friendly with the US, maintain the traditional friendship, but open communications with China and to improve relations with China. And hopefully this will also ease the strategic rivalry and ease the great power competition. When you ask about the US pivot, of course, it's a big test. From the point of view of the Philippines, there has been a lot of question raised as to whether the Philippines can rely on the U.S. security and umbrella. Will the U.S. really fight a war with China over Scarborough Shoal or over the Spratlys? For a number of Filipinos, a growing number, there is growing doubt. And basically because that in the end, we'll have to defend ourselves. And so instead of choosing the path of war, we thought it is best to move slowly, but to improve relations and therefore ease the tensions.
All right, this is a point that I want to put to our guest in Singapore. Graham, I'll be with you on that in a moment, but there's one other part of all of this that I want to discuss with you first. As part of what he calls that pivot to Asia, Barack Obama has been strongly promoting a free trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Now, that deal aims to deepen economic ties between the US and 11 countries in Asia, South America and Oceania. It reduces taxes on imports to encourage trade. China isn't part of that pact. But now the plan to forge that large Asia-Pacific trade deal, excluding Beijing, is stumbling under domestic pressure in the US. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump say they'd reject the deal if elected as president. Graham, in Singapore, has President Obama's apparent inability to push this TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, damaged the US's reputation as a strong ally, its ability to influence? How do countries in the region feel about it?
Well, speaking from I can't speak on behalf of the Singapore government because I don't represent the Singapore government. But speaking from an analytical and academic perspective, I think there has been a dent, to be sure, in the TPP hitting a quagmire. Essentially, one could say it's dead in the water. There's increasing skepticism that the TPP is going to take off. It's unlikely to be ratified by Congress, US Congress, by the end of the year. Our top leaders in Singapore have talked about their stakes, the country's stakes in the TPP and what the TPP can portend to bring to the region. But having said that, I think there's a need to move on. Notwithstanding what the TPP was meant to promise. But essentially, yes, it might be a signal that the US is in decline in the region, and hence, once again, the options are on the table for us to start looking at how we're going to navigate through that. But having said that, we're still hedging. It's still early days.
Graham, we're coming towards the end of the program. I have a feeling this may well be my last question, but we heard both Victor in Beijing talking about wanting to know what the US's true game plan is. We heard Chito Santoromana there saying that neither the US or China want to lose influence in the region. Are the US and China perhaps heading, do you think, towards a military confrontation in the region? Is that a possibility? Is that a dangerous possibility?
Yes, I think it would be naive for any one of us to rule out that prospect. And I say that for various reasons, but one of which is that it should also be a disciplining force for us to align and to avert that prospect from realizing. I think clearly there is room for accommodation. We discussed that this evening. But at the same time, there is this growing clash and this growing tension, and it seems to be coming to a head, simply because there is this clash of interests and this refusal to empathize and see the interests and the rationale of both sides, and it's quite alarming, and all the more why we need to have more conversations about this issue. I firmly believe we haven't exhausted those channels yet, and there's still room for maneuver.
So dialogue has to be the way forward, really, and so you can't blame nations in the region for wanting to at least turn towards China right now, even though their traditional ally is the US. Absolutely.
I think it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's not a case of winners and losers here. I think with accommodation and with finding those common grounds, there is enough strategic and economic cachet to go around. I truly believe that. We have to move away from this harsh, zero-sum, realpolitik model that seems to be steering us towards this collision course. All the more reasons why I think we need frank conversations. I think we're having that. We're having the ruffling of feathers. I think that's inevitable. But I think in order to reach that end state where we can find that common ground and avert conflict, I think we ought to continue pursuing that. There's going to be a little bit of pain points along the way, but I think that's necessary for us to get to where we want to go.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to end our discussion. We're out of time. Thank you, Chito Santoromana, Graham Ong Webb, and Victor Gao. Thank you, as always, for watching. Don't forget, you can see our program again at any time by going to the website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion on today's conversation, then please join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Our handle, AJ Inside, at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. See you again. Bye-bye.